Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second in the series of neurodiversity. I want to thank again Dr. Diana Perry-Cruz and Dr. Jason Clements for facilitating these for us. Today, we're going to be talking about ableism in the educational system, the social versus medical model of disability. As always, we're going to record this session, and the entirety is going to be recorded this time, including the discussion portion. And all of those will be posted to the Center for Inclusive Excellence's YouTube. So with that, I will turn it over to Diana and Jason.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. I am Diana Perry-Cruz, and Jason Clements and I are going to be leading this group for you all today. If you didn't come to the previous talk, that was the one in which we sort of introduced some neurodiversity terms. And then our goal for today was to talk about ableism generally, and then applying that, there we go, a little bit more specifically to the educational systems that we all use. So our goal for today is just, first of all, to define what ableism means, and then to place that into a discussion on the medical versus the social model of disability, and then just consider how that may then influence our pedagogical practices, but that conversation will probably end up being saved for one of the future lunch and learns that we hope to do. So thanks for coming, and that's like a lot to get through in a short period of time, so we'll see kind of how we do. And like I said, I'm Diana Perry-Cruz. In case you didn't meet me last time, I am a professor here at Regis in the ABA department. My background is working with very young autistic learners, and I know lots of different and live with many different neurodivergent people as well. Jason, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Jason Clements. I'm a professor of English and Film Studies and chair of the Humanities Department. And I had, well, both of my children went to Regis Children's Center, and one of them participated in, it was called Social Scientists, I think, at the time, Diana.
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
And were you were part of it then in like 2019? Yeah, okay, so my son worked with Diana to some extent, and my son actually was also diagnosed as being on the spectrum earlier this year. And so I have a lot of personal background on the topic, since I think I said last week, both my son and I are both have ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and are on the spectrum.
Great, thank you for that, and thanks for sharing. All right, so in attempting to plan this, I've pulled in a lot of different things, and I'm hoping that it will come through in a way that is, you know, structured and useful for you all, because there's a lot of different things I wanted to make sure we brought up. And if it's not, I apologize. But the first thing that we want to make sure we do here is talk about ableism and what the term ableism means. And forgive me if lots of folks already know that term, then that is fantastic. But in case you're not familiar with it, I wanted to kind of start us in that place. I will tell you the truth, like I didn't really know this term until a few years ago when I started getting into more of this type of research. And it's another ism, right? So we're usually familiar with other isms that we hear about in society. So we're familiar with racism, sexism, ageism, right? And so ableism kind of fits in the same vein of those. But the term that or the definition, I guess, that's easiest for me to understand, because it's almost like, it's like a backwards ism, basically, is if you think of it as disability discrimination. So treating people who have any type of disability differently from others, and also coming into those interactions with usually unconscious, subconscious view that someone who has a disability is sort of less than someone who doesn't have a disability. So that's sort of the core, the kernel of that discrimination. And like I just said, it's not usually something that's happening at a conscious level. It's not something that you as an individual person had to identify as like, this is part of my worldview. It's built into our societal systems, this perspective that there is difference related to ability and disability. And so that's problematic, because obviously we don't want to have those judgments being carried around with us. but it's something that just by being alive and existing in the world that we do, you may harbor some of these biases without realizing it. So ableism is something just like racism, sexism, ageism, all of them, right? That we have to actively work against in order to ensure that we are living an unbiased life as we possibly can.
And I
So
don't know if there's,
yeah.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know if there's a, a sociological or just otherwise in the literature around this sort of thing for the distinction that I want to draw here. But I think it's important to note as well that whereas a lot of ableism is thinking that because somebody has a disability, they, as you said, they're less than, or they don't live as fulfilling a life, or they're unable to do things that maybe actually they can do just differently, or maybe not even differently. Maybe, I mean, in some cases, just that you might just simply underestimate a person with a disability, right? But I think that when we talk, as we are here, about neurodivergence and the disabilities that kind of fall under that, a problem as well is that it's not just like, oh, you're a disabled person, so I'm going to perhaps even unconsciously or through implicit bias think differently or less of you. I think there's also the sense that, like, well, what do you mean you can't do this thing, or what do you mean you don't understand that? Like, it's so right. I mean, there's this sense that even if one accepts the diagnosis or the what is going on with a person's neurodiversity, there's this sense like, well, why can't you just do it, right, or do this? And I think that with physical disabilities, we kind of accept that there's a can't there, a limit, a valid one, whereas with mental or emotional, we tend to, maybe not intentionally, but I think, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this too, that we sometimes think that it's just a matter of won't rather than can't,
Yes.
right? And I think that is just another sort of strain of ableism, but I just wanted to point out how it's kind of distinct from thinking like you're disabled, so you are lesser than, but also like, well, I accept that you have that disability, but I mean, come on, anybody can just do then whatever it is.
Such a great point. Yes, exactly. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about invisible disabilities, right?
Yeah.
And so this could fall into that category as well. So it's not something that, is distinguishable just upon looking at a person.
Right.
And so that brings in exactly what you're talking about there. Why can't you just do this thing that we're asking everybody to do? It comes easy to, 90% of people, and why can't it also come easy to you, neurodivergent person, right? And it may also be a case where someone can do the thing that you're asking them to do, but it's really, really hard for them to do, and it's really, really draining. And I haven't included a slide here with talking about masking, but masking can be, making changes to sort of what is generally your comfort type of presentation so that you can fit in with societal expectations. And that can be really emotionally hard and traumatic for people to do long term. So that is another important factor to bring in here. So that was great, Jason. Yeah, so when we talk about ableism generally, that could be for lots of different types of disabilities. And I think you guys are familiar with this idea that our world is designed for the majority of people. So if you fall outside of that majority, often things haven't been, consciously designed for you. If the people who are making those decisions about what things might look like, what the expectations are, didn't have that in mind. So it's easy often to see this with not taking into consideration physical disability, but we can also look at ableist practices in our society for folks who have mental or intellectual disability or social disability, which some forms of neurodivergence could be presented as. All right, so I grabbed this because I want us to introduce this idea of ableism, but also start to think about it in terms of what, we're working with students who are now at a collegiate level, but they, chances are, have experienced a good amount of ableism growing up through systems as well, their educational systems too. So when we think about what ableism might look like for them, it could look like something that we perhaps inadvertently are presenting as professors in our classes, which I'll give some potential examples of later. But we also should think about, their individual lived history with respect to how people may have been treating them in the past too, and how that could then impact their interactions with their professors, their fellow students, etc. So I grabbed this quote from Johnson, 2003, just to give us some examples of how ableism might look for students with varying disabilities. From an ableist perspective, the devaluation of disability results in social attitudes that uncritically assert that it's better for a child to walk than to roll, speak than sign, read print than braille, spell independently than use a spell check, and hang out with non-disabled kids as opposed to other disabled kids, which is another form of ableism. So I
kind of wish that Johnson had said imply rather than assert, because so much of it, I think, is what we suggest through non-explicit things that we say and suggest, right? I mean, you're not probably going to hear a teacher say, it is better to be able to walk than to roll in a wheelchair, right? I mean, they're probably not going to literally say that or assert it. But but it's like a lot of implicit bias things, it kind of comes out through just the way that we think of things, right? I mean, I right down to the fact that I teach a poem by Alfred Tennyson. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. That I teach a poem by Alfred Tennyson called The Eagle. And at the end of it's a very short poem, and at the end of the first stanza, it ends with the word stands. It's that the eagle stands like on a branch overlooking a mountain. And then the last word of the second stanza, and thus the whole poem, is falls, right? And we spent a bunch of time talking about how that could have like biblical imagery, because like the fall of man, or the fall of, the fallen angel from heaven to hell and all this stuff. But then I even once said, like, but think about it, right? Like, we put a lot of emphasis and positive connotation on standing, right? You stand for what you believe in, right? You stand up for somebody who's being persecuted, right? You stand for your principles, all these things. It's like standing has all these baked in positive connotations. And I thought to pivot the discussion in that direction, because my original thing was like, yeah, so if the eagle stands, like, that's really majestic and proud and good. Like, I mean, just uncritically talking about how like the very image of standing, which of course is something many disabled people cannot do, that it is this inherently good thing. So I thought to retweak that presentation of it, but again, it's just like one of a bazillion ways that, the attitude, if not the intent of ableism, can kind of bubble up without you meaning it to. So I realize that's a very sort of particular and almost like, oh, come on, Tennyson didn't mean anything by that. But well, of course he didn't, right? I mean, we usually don't mean anything by that. But nonetheless, studying it in terms of, that word stand is inherently positive, it can have that subtext.
Great. Yeah, there's so many embedded ableist language within like phrasing that we use too, without necessarily realizing it. And I didn't include a ton of examples of that here, but you can definitely like Google it, but saying things like turning a blind eye, right? Or oh, of course I can't think of any of them right now, but that is
both Beyonce and Lizzo had kind of a kerfuffle in the past year of using the word spaz in a very like sort of casual, kind of demeaning way, not demeaning toward people with spastic issues, but toward just generally like how in a 90s sitcom a kid would refer to another kid as a spaz if they're like being kind of socially awkward or whatever. So yeah, two of these very prominent artists, both of whom are known for their inclusivity, I think just didn't know that that word, like turn a blind eye, actually has this ableist connotation. To their credit, they both edited their songs. It was very cool.
Yes, they did. Yes. Great example.
Thanks.
So yeah, so, before we get into this whole discussion regarding different models of disability, I also want to make sure that I'm presenting this for us here to understand that disability is not a bad word. It's not bad to say that someone's disabled. It's not bad to be disabled. We all need help in different areas. And again, this is, part of like many of our social understandings of disability and ableism, that we will shy away sometimes from having these types of conversations. And it ends up making it, again, be kind of like built into our interpretation of what it means to be disabled by wanting to avoid these conversations. So a person's value is not based on their independence level, on their output, on their societal contributions, on their financial contributions, etc. Right? We are all valued as persons because we exist and we have rights. And whether you need assistance in varying areas should not have any value on what you contribute by being present in this world. So I just want to present that first. And if that's like a different idea for you, then that's okay, right? Like we all have to kind of like work through some of these things if you haven't thought about them before. But just wanted to present that as part of this conversation. And then a person is not quote unquote inspirational just for living with a disability, right? Everybody is themselves. And we do not want to give the idea that someone is like a spectacle to be observed and then celebrated just by attempting to live their own life. When people do awesome things, like let's celebrate that. But the term for that is called inspiration porn. When sometimes you'll see like, oh, isn't it amazing? This person with a disability did this thing. And then everyone will kind of jump on because it makes them feel good about themselves by saying, oh, wow, look how great this was for this person to do. But it's you kind of have to dig deeper into thinking about what that means and why our society likes stories like that to kind of get at what sometimes is an unconscious core of it, that there's some ableist perspectives at the core. I'm trying to monitor the chat as we're going here. But if something's important is happening, just let me know in there. Okay. So like I said, when we're thinking about physical disability, I think that we can see ableism and how it may be structured into our society relatively easily because it's not an invisible disability, right? So certainly when we talk about how our buildings are designed, whether they were designed with ramps and elevators, right? And what the arrangement is to try to just physically get around in a space. Sometimes we can easily see where those considerations were not made in the design of the building, right? And that can definitely has to do with the age of the building. But that's one where it's maybe easy to see. In other areas, I was, try to come up with some examples for us that may be slightly less visible. So I said, how about the fact that you always have to opt in to closed captioning on your TV screen? Like, for example, I don't know about you guys, but I only watch TV with the closed captioning on. Yes,
Drives my wife crazy, but yes, same.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, my house is so loud because I have 3 boys and a husband, and they're all very loud. And so I can't half the time hear what's going on unless I have the closed captioning on. But I also am not a great auditory processor. So for me, like reading it on the screen is way better, although the jokes do kind of get ruined, right? But then I went to the movies, which is like a rare occurrence for me. And I was like, where are the subtitles on this movie? They're not here. And there's not even, like, how odd, right? That there's not even an option there. There's probably plenty of people who are hard of hearing who want to go to the movies. And it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to do so, right?
And
So,
Erica just said, or a live Broadway show, which, yeah, so similar issue, but I happen to know that they could do it because the only Broadway show I've ever been to in my life was La Boheme, which was adapted into Rent ultimately. But the version that I saw, it was when I was still in college, but the production that I saw was in French. And it was on Broadway in New York City. So they had to put up subtitles, and they had 2 big screens to do exactly that. It clearly wasn't that hard for them to do it, so it's just one of those things where like an accommodation that could definitely be done, but they just don't.
do you parle français?
Sorry? Oh.
I said, do you parle français?
Oh.
No.
No.
No, me neither.
Despite my last name, which is very French, I'm not fluent.
Okay. I would not be able to do that either. Okay, good. Another one I thought about is, what about our attitude toward trade schools, right? So we're all here, we're all like, we're in it to win it, right? And giving it the old college try over here. And I think that our society often looks down on folks who don't want to go to college and who want to pursue other types of degrees. And that could be potentially an ableist perspective as well. And then, as many of you noted as well, the language that we use has a lot of ableist undertones to it too. And I have only included a small sampling of phrases or words that could be viewed as ableist. I've worked hard in my own personal vocabulary to try to catch any of these that may be present and replace them with other words, but it's hard because we all have a learning history, right? With the ways in which we talk and how we've learned in the past. So it's a process. It'll take you a year probably to remove any of these that you might accidentally have in your language. And when you see them, you're like, oh, I never thought about how that, what that traces itself back to. And I'm going to make sure I don't use it in the future. So, and then I included a couple that I felt maybe particularly related to our conversations about neurodivergence. One being, I don't know if you've heard people say this, but they'll say, oh, I'm so OCD because they want to have like a clean kitchen or something like that, right? And that doesn't mean that they actually have a diagnosis of being OCD, but they've sort of co-opted that term and are using it in another way.
And I hate that one too. Sorry, hate is a strong word, but that's a huge pet peeve for me, the OCD thing. Partially because the phrasing suggests that it's what you are rather than a thing you have. So that's always frustrating. But also because like you said, oh, I like my kitchen to be tidy. I have the response I always want to say when somebody says that, because it's about, I don't know, like that they like their car to be tidy or whatever. I always want to say, no, you're fastidious, and that's fine. But yeah, it's odd that of all of the sort of mental health pathologies, that one gets used so casually and readily. It's interesting.
For sure. Yeah. And then the other one I listed here was assuming a person is autistic, someone saying you don't look autistic to them, which again, would indicate that maybe you don't understand autism, but also you have a negative view of what that means, right? So it's like, oh, I'm giving you a compliment by saying you don't look autistic,
right? But
the person isn't saying that they don't want to be autistic, right? So
it is backhanded at best.
Yes, there we go. All right, so those are definitely some things to think about there. Excuse me. And then I added this slide in for us too, because I want us to, take this conversation into the realm of neurodivergence and how ableism sort of may touch those different areas too. So I've got a picture here. Who knows who I've got up here on the screen? Erica.
Dr. Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang.
Yes.
Jim Parsons is his real name.
Yes, and I have nothing against Jim Parsons. I've seen him in some other stuff I thought he's great in. And this often comes up when people say, like, what are some representations of autistic people in the media? And although I'm not sure that they out and out state that, I'm not sure that Sheldon's autistic, but, beat for beat, he sort of matches up to a stereotypical view of someone who is autistic. So I popped him up here so we could sort of think about that if this is a reference that you're familiar with. And there are better representations in the media than Sheldon Cooper. Thank you, Erica. But this is one that a lot of people know. And I think one that, if we think about ableism, is problematic. So it's a very stereotyped view, right? He's really, the way the character is presented, he's really played for laughs. And like, that's not to say that you can't have a funny show that revolves around autism, but it's more like you're laughing at him than with him, right? And the other thing that I think is pretty common in these types of views is that the he's got some quirks, right? And the quirks are sort of like tolerated by the people around him, but they're definitely not celebrated by the people around him. And then on the flip side, they're not, the quirks are not overly disabling for him either. So it sort of just lands in the realm of, this is a little bit different, but as long as he works hard, he can overcome whatever those things are, right? That maybe are challenging for him. And
Well, and he's a genius, right? I mean, that's
yes.
kind of one of the other stereotypes of it, is like the savant or genius, or the person who gets so obsessively into one thing that they become like the world's leading expert on it. I mean, that's that trope gets hammered pretty hard. So the fact that all of the main characters on that show are supposed to be, you know, very intelligent, they're all doctors and engineers and academics and things like that. But he is very clearly made out that he's the one who graduated high school when he was 10, right? Or went to Harvard when he was, you know, 15, or like those those character traits are really hammered home for him, right? Like that, yeah, everybody on the show is smart, all the main characters in a book smart sort of way, but that he is far and away portrayed as being the most genius, to like at savant level, like multiple languages and can speed read and understand all these complicated things, right? But so it's that, but it's also that he's book smart, right? And that conversely, whereas he's so book smart, his social intelligence is just like rock bottom, like just as inept and, you know, abrasive and every stereotype you can think of as can possibly be. So it's like they took those two ideas. Oh, autistic people can also be geniuses, and sometimes that's even sort of like interrelated in some way, like their devotion to a single topic, for instance, right? So on the one hand but so let's just take that and push it to the absolute limit. And let's take the idea that neurodivergent or autistic people are often not good in social situations and push that to its absolute limit, right? So he just becomes this, at times, very humorous, I admit. Like there are definitely times when he will say or do things that are, I think, genuinely comedic. But I mean, it's like they just took those two core stereotypes and just blew them up like as far as they possibly could be.
Yeah. Thank you. You described that way better. And then I was looking at the chat. Yes, people are bringing up some great points, which include non-autistic actors playing autistic roles, which is problematic. And the show As We See It is written and then also acted by autistic actors and has gotten a lot of good reviews as well, if you're looking for something that is maybe a little more authentic. And so I think that people may come away from like watching a character like Sheldon with some of these kind of phrases that you might see down here at the bottom, which perpetuate these stereotypes as well as ableist perspectives. Oh, this guy's annoying, but he's funny, right? So that's like that othering kind of perspective. And why doesn't he just do X, Y, or Z? Like Jason just said before, can't he sort of see that everyone is finding this behavior annoying, and can't he just change that? Or doesn't he realize that everyone else is doing it this way, right? And why can't he just do it that way too, or whatever the case might be? So it's, you know, a limitation on the viewer, our perspective on what this experience is like for someone, in this case, an autistic person, that we're unable to sort of shift our perspective to see what life might be like for them, why they might be behaving in this way instead. And then we kind of add in that layer on top of it of, well, my way's better than your way, right? And why can't you just be more like me? Those are challenges in our perspective that maybe we want to update.
I don't mean for this to turn into a film and television studies session in which I analyze the character of Sheldon, but two other things I just want to say about that. One is, as I think you said, it's never confirmed whether he is on the spectrum or not. Right? I stopped watching after a certain. The show went on for so long, but so I haven't seen the most recent ones. But that was always my understanding, was that it was never confirmed one way or the other, which is actually sort of impressive for that sort of show. I mean, that's a show owned by the producer Chuck Lorre, who also made 2.5 Men, not exactly known for his subtlety. So the fact that they did leave that unspoken is sort of surprising. Though again, maybe it's like a plausible deniability thing, right? If we get called out for ableism, we could say, well, we never said he was, you know, so it could be that.
Yeah.
But also one other factor about Sheldon is that for the vast run of the series, and I think this was actually changing just as I tapped out of watching it. But for the most of the run of the series, he was presented as aggressively asexual, or aromantic as well. And I think that that's a stereotype that goes with all manner of disability, perhaps including and especially neurological disability, is the idea that what we think of as, you know, normal desires or desire for companionship or a romantic partner or whatever else just somehow doesn't register for autistic people or neurodivergent people. And I think that that can be the case. I think that I believe I've heard, how's that for a solid academic citing? But I mean, I think the idea exists that there is perhaps a higher rate of asexuality or aromantic leanings among the neurodiverse. But again, this show really leans heavily on that. And it's not in order to make some sort of suggestion that neurodiversity can sort of muddle or otherwise impact interpersonal relationships or even our desire for them. I think instead it perpetuates this idea that, you know, a person with a disability, regardless of what sort it might be, just shouldn't even be participating in such things or have it, right? I mean, I think that it more than anything kind of pushes this idea that to be disabled is to also not have that component of your humanity. I think that stereotype kind of does exist out there. Yes.
Very well put.
Yeah,
yes.
and I like Courtney's point there, paternalistic.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Courtney. Great. All right, so to bring that, what we now maybe are thinking about related to ableism and mapping it onto what we think about a disability. This slide was from last week, so it's just a review to kind of bring us back. So we had talked about neurodivergence, whether it's a disability on its face, and we said, no, it's not a disability, it's just a difference, right? So we all have, you know, different minds, different brains, and it's not an intellectual disability either. But what we want to now bring into this conversation is, if you are neurodivergent, then there may be differences in how you perceive the world, how you interact with the world, and what your needs are in those interactions, that if they're not taken into account and consideration, can function as a disability in your interaction with the environment / society, right? So that's what I want to move our conversation toward. So when we're thinking about disability, this is my example. Let's say someone is hard of hearing or deaf. If we were to make changes to the physical environment, can that disability be minimized? So we're not changing the person, right? But are there ways in which we can change the setting that can make that person be able to interact in whatever way and as fully as they want to with the environment? Does anyone have an example of what you could do?
All kinds of examples in
the
world. Sorry, I take space, make space. Just even any of the microphones or the various systems that we have, hearing aids for the person, or ability to microphone the person talking. So you can look at it as a system. You could look at it as the two individuals in the setting, and you could also just have it be something where microphone technology has gotten so good in the last 10 years. What we can do, it's quite extraordinary.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I see people added to the chat too. Thanks, Becky. So you could provide an ASL interpreter, you could provide closed captioning, you could add a microphone. Let's say it's a talk, right? Like a microphone for the speaker that could feed directly to the person as well. So there are lots of different things that we could do in that environment to make it so that the disability of being hard of hearing is minimized in that particular setting. So we haven't changed the person, right? But we've found ways to accommodate that challenge such that it's no longer really a challenge for them. They're able to, in this setting, experience everything that they need to. Now, do we always do that? No, and that's a problem. But we're able to address it pretty much effectively if we plan ahead and make those changes. What have I done? Oh, there we go. So that is maybe a relatively more easy example, right? Okay, sorry, I'm distracted by the chat. But if you start to extrapolate this out, you will quickly see that some disabilities would potentially require more accommodation, some would require less accommodation. Some, even if we are doing our best to make those accommodations, they may not, fully be sort of resolved in that particular environment. And so I'm not saying like everything is, everything's going to be the same in every different situation. It's going to be an individualized experience, but our goal is equitable experience for everyone. And that can be reached in sort of a variety of ways. Now, when we shift that conversation away from, disability as a whole to looking at specifically neurodivergence, I also want to introduce these two ideas of the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And I guess this can actually be applied in multiple ways, but it fits really nicely and in an important way with the conversations that folks have about neurodivergence. So the medical model is the one in which if you went to school and you were a psych major or any other social sciences related area, this is the model that you probably learned. This is the model that the DSM is based on and that, psychiatry as a whole was built upon. So when folks say, oh, I have an autism diagnosis, or I have an ASD diagnosis, those are the same thing, an ADHD diagnosis, sorry, that diagnosis came from the DSM. And there's a list of criteria that the diagnosing doctor has to observe, have you tell them about, right? And they get sort of like checked off. It's like a checklist. But the way in which that checklist looks, it's a lot of things that are challenging for that person, or a lot of behavioral presentations that are considered to be outside of the quote unquote norm that get checked off in order to determine if that person meets the criteria for the diagnosis. Now, this model is based on the idea of the medical model like we would use in medicine. So you go to the doctor and you say, I don't know, my back hurts. And they're going to check through and see all of the different symptoms that you list for them. And they will then therefore give you a diagnosis, which is, oh, you're just getting old, or you pulled a muscle in your back, or whatever it might be. The diagnosis is therefore going to be indicative of what needs to happen next, with the underlying understanding that you want to reduce the symptoms that got you brought to the doctor in the first place. So you need to do these stretching exercises in order to not have your back hurt anymore, and then you will be quote unquote cured of that problem. When we think about it with respect to the stuff that's listed in the DSM, it's the same model, right? It's like check, check, check. These are all the things you're presenting to me as challenges for you. And therefore, the next step would be, I tell you things to do to reduce the number of checks that you have on this checklist. With the goal, quote unquote, goal of being quote unquote cured. So the way in which a lot of discussion around neurodivergent perspectives and autistic presentation in particular is based on this type of medical model that says you don't fit in with society, right? There's these things that I've observed or you've told me about, and obviously you'd want to decrease them so that you do fit into society. Now you can see why this could be viewed as problematic in the context of the ableism discussion that we just had. So the other way that we can think about disability is what's called the social model of disability. And let me preface, there are multiple versions of the social model of disability. So I'm just giving us like a quick one here, but the focus for the social model of disability is that we're moving away from identifying particular symptoms or, quote unquote deficits that a person's presenting with, and moving the focus instead to the interaction between the person and the environment. And by environment, I just mean like entire like setting, including like society that they are living in. So no longer is it the person is the problem, right? But rather, this is a person, and this is how they're presenting, and this is the environment in which they live, and they're not meshing up in the way that's most beneficial for that person. There are changes that we can potentially make to that environment, such, as a metaphor, adding closed captioning, right? That would make it a lot easier for that person to exist in that environment and have them be able to participate fully and benefit from the interactions that they have in their environment or social setting. So no longer is the focus on how we're going to change this person, right? I'm not trying to eliminate things that are listed on the checklist, but rather, if there are things on the checklist or experiences that they're having that we can make modifications to how we exist as a whole to make that interaction easier for them, then by George, let's do it, right? So we don't have to think of the symptoms, quote unquote symptoms that are listed on the checklist as being automatically deficits or problems or challenges, because some of those things may in fact be strengths for that person. And they may be really central and important to that person's identity as well. So they wouldn't be things that we would want to see changed. But instead, we want to look at that interaction. So you may have some environments in which aspects of that environment are really disabling for you, right? And then other environments in which everything's fine and there don't need to be accommodations. So how a person is interacting with that environment may change environment to environment, and how disabled a person may feel in a certain setting is going to be potentially dependent on that setting as well. Who's there, how chaotic is the setting, what are the expectations in the setting, etc. So the idea here rather is that we are going to change the environment and therefore reduce the barriers to participation, barriers to learning, etc. that may exist within it in that environment. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So that's those are these two models, right? And like I said, not every, oh, this brings up another point. Okay, so not every situation is going to be the same, and not every accommodation is going to be perfect, but that's what we're striving toward, is that we're making accommodations such that people can participate fully and equitably in whatever setting they might be in. Now, this brings up another point that I don't think I've brought up yet. And that is person, and this is really specific to autism, person first versus identity first language. And I'll just say this really briefly. The medical model lends itself to person first language. So a person with Down syndrome, right? Person with cancer, let's say. And this is the model that many people, including myself, are trained on. So we say, like, we care about the person, right? We're focused on the person. And so that's our goal, is that we're going to help this person here. But the kind of underlying side of that, especially like person with cancer, is that you want to get rid of the cancer and leave the person. Many autistic individuals do not like person first language because it implies that the person and their autism are separate things, rather than autism being part of who they are. And that's where identity first language comes in instead. So that's why I have been trying to say autistic individuals, et cetera, rather than person with autism. Individuals may have different preference, so if you can ask them what they prefer, then that's the better thing to do. But as a whole, the autistic community has shared strong preference toward identity first language. So that might be something to consider. All right, so we had our example before about someone has a hearing disability and how we might make modifications to the environment, right? So here are some other ways in which people may have a disconnect with the environment and the expectations in that environment. And I want us to think about how we might make modifications to that setting for them. So let's say someone has a hard time with small talk or with group work. Sometimes that's an expectation in class. Are there ways in which we can modify that to make that less of a disability in that setting for them? Let's say someone is falling behind in their assignments due to organizational challenges or executive functioning. That's particularly challenging for them. Are there ways in which we can make environmental modifications such that that is less of a concern for them and for us as the professor? What if someone has a hard time auditorily processing questions, but this is something that the professor does a lot in class? Are there things that we can make modifications for in this setting? So I'm not going to require you to give me answers to this, but I want you to think about it because this is how we interpret what we've discussed so far over into thinking about neurodivergence and ways in which we may see some disability and some disability interaction with the environment with neurodivergent presentations. So if we're able to make these modifications and still have the person experience fully what the intention was as for that class, for example, through those environmental modifications, then the quote unquote problem really was mostly an ableist one, right? We just hadn't necessarily made those accommodations for someone who may experience the world differently. Now, I did some brainstorming, and there may be some more brainstorming to be done because I didn't get Iowa on my list, but I thought about some quote unquote baked in societal expectations that we might have in the classroom that you don't even think about it, right? Like, we've all gone to school. We're all, like, many of us here are professors. We went to school our whole lives. We just never stopped, right? We love it here. So for us, probably many of the things that we're being asked to do on this list are like, we don't even think about them because they've just been our whole lives, right? But these are the things that we're often asking students to do just in the context of coming to class. This is just in the context of going to college. And for some folks, they may breeze right through these, but for other individuals, some or many of these things may actually be challenging for them. So being asked to sit in your seat, take notes, to raise your hand before you speak, to remember and meet deadlines, writing polite emails, taking tests, writing papers, deferring to the professor, oh, what the professor says is kind of that's the answer, right? Engaging in polite debate. I know that one's already come up. And doing group work. Those are often components of classes, and we might not realize necessarily that they're challenging for people. But depending on some components of a neurodivergent presentation, there may be challenges for many of these things that are presented here. And I, just kind of quickly wrote down some ways in which people might be having a challenging time in these different areas so that we can think about it. Because I think if you maybe don't stop and think, you're like, well, why can't this person meet this deadline, right? Or why did they write their email to me and it made it sound like that, right? Or why does no one want to be in a group with this person, right? And why are they always sitting by themselves when it's think, pair, share time, things like that. But there could be many underlying reasons why this is occurring that map onto potential neurodivergence. And like we said last week, you don't have to know if someone's neurodivergent in order to support them well, but any of these might be reasons why. So we're going to go into more depth next time we meet, which is in May, to talk about what those mean and how we might be able to help design our classrooms in ways that we are reducing some of those potential barriers. And this is the last thing that I wanted us to leave with here, was thinking about what we want our students to take away and having that be our focus versus some of the process by which we can get there. Because there might be multiple ways for us to get our students where they need to go that maybe we just haven't thought about yet, right? Ways in which we might be able to be flexible in our teaching. So that's what we'll talk about next time. But I wanted to save us a few minutes so that we can hear from you if there are particular, anonymized experiences that you've had at Regis, or questions that you might have about ableism, or comments. We would love to hear them. Eye contact, Becky. Yes, absolutely.
I'll share some experiences at Regis. I think Regis on paper is very open and wanting to do as much as we can. The problem is the training takes time, and it takes years, and it takes understanding. I mean, I had full support to give voice lessons to a hearing impaired student, which was a wonderful learning experience for me, because, I've sort of been teaching it in a particular way, and it helped expand that. And I like that Regis does try to think outside the box. And I think we're getting more and more educated about looking at the interaction between the person and the school. So that's my quick take.
Yeah, it definitely does take time. Yeah. Thanks.
I like how one of the things on that last slide specifically refers to removing the barrier, because obviously we know that like accommodations or special ways of accessing course material activities can be necessary and important, and that's obviously a good thing. But I like that the instinct should be not to say, well, what is something special we can put in place to help this person overcome this, but rather, do we even need that thing to be a thing that is providing the barrier in the first place, right? I know everybody's seen those memes of like the three kids watching a baseball game, right?
Yeah.
And one of them can't see over the fence, so it illustrates equality with everyone gets one box to stand on, but the two taller people, now they're just higher, but they could see anyway, and the smaller ones still can't see, right? And then equity is the smaller one gets two boxes, so now everybody can see. But then isn't there an updated version where the last thing is just no more? It's not the fence isn't there, right? Or it becomes a chain link fence at least. I mean, you got to have something to stop the home runs and foul balls from getting away, but at least with a chain link fence, you can see through it. Barrier removed. We don't even need the boxes. And to put it in one other sort of random analogy. I used to play music a lot, and the best advice I ever heard for customizing tone when you're playing music or recording or whatever was, if you feel that you need more bass in the sound, don't add bass, remove treble, because treble, of course, is the opposite of bass. So the idea is, don't think that you always need more. Think about what's the thing that's in contrast with it that you could have less of. And I always took that to heart, and honestly, it makes music sound better, because you're not adding more to the signal that can like overload the signal. But anyway, I think that principle is really cool, and something that we sometimes like skip right past and start thinking, instead of in terms of, well, what could we just kind of clear out of the way? We're trying to think about, innovative solutions. And I'm not trying to put down innovative solutions. Obviously, they're great. But yeah, I like the possibility that is kind of inheres in that.
Oh yeah, that's a great suggestion. Erica said less is more. More? Just jump in.
So not specific to Regis, but I think in general, as anything with public education, it's very slow and, it's a real paradigm and culture shift that needs to be experienced. But I'm hoping, and I'm seeing that as the neurodivergent perspective becomes more well-known, students are learning to advocate for themselves at a younger age. And so that will hopefully help as they get into college to be able to clearly express the things that work for them and don't, to be able to help professors in a better way. So they're not having to sort of hunt and peck and figure out how they can best support students.
Yes.
I think,
Ideally, it would be a two-way street. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Courtney.
no, sorry, I was just going to say, I think something that we run into as well is that oftentimes the students are coming from a world where they were sort of told what they needed, and it was just sort of given to them, whether or not it was really clear why they were receiving certain supports.
Mm.
And so students come to us and they don't really know what they need to remove the barrier. I'm struggling with reading comprehension, but I don't know how to improve that. And so I think that's a shift we all are sort of experiencing and trying to figure out is how can we make content, classrooms, things like that more equitable for students who just experience them differently. And they don't always know how to do that either.
I think that's an interesting point you bring up, Courtney. Last time, I think it was Julia that said that oftentimes the accommodations don't really match, or when they're talking to the students about the accommodation, they're like, I don't really need that. They need something different, but that's what is prescriptive for them. That's what's written out for them. So that is a bit of a challenge that I think we will continue to grapple with in higher education in general, not just higher ed, as we are becoming more educated, and also how technology is evolving around us to maybe reduce some barriers, not, of course, not all barriers, but I do think there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, because when you as a kid especially get a neuropsych workup, a large section of it will be like recommendations for dealing with this, and that'll be several pages sometimes. And then yes, I have both mine from 1996 and I have my son's from earlier this year. So, and then those recommendations usually go into your meeting with the special education coordinator at school to form the IEP. And then if the IEP seems to be working, that's just what you do from then on, right? So those recommendations that some of our students might have had about how they can better access education might have been from like when they were in 5th grade or earlier even, right? And great, that's how their IEP was formed. That's how it sort of made it official that they need this extra help or accommodations or however we want to think about it. But is it necessarily exactly the same at 18 or 19, right? And then in a college setting, and with all of the social factors that come into it as well. So I mean, obviously not in any way trying to put down the important work that you're doing with accommodations or anything else, Courtney, but I would want to, well, also you're the one who brought it up, so I think it's okay. But just pointing out too that, yeah, they often, it might not be doing exactly what they need, and it might just be because they're so used to, this is my diagnosis, these are the recommendations that were made when I was 9, that might not always be, still the most helpful thing. Indeed.
The last several years, there's been more of a movement in education for transition services to become a greater part of what they're doing, even from middle to high school, and then of course high school to whatever comes next. And I'm hopeful too that more of that will be baked into that process about what's working for you as a person and what will you need when you carry on to whatever your next adventure is.
I am absolutely loving this conversation, and I think that there's been a lot of wonderful comments here, but unfortunately have to pay attention to the time here, and it says we are at 1:30. And so what I'd encourage you to do, if there's any questions that are specific to your classroom, drop them in the chat now, because as Diana has already hinted at and alluded to, we are going to have some sessions coming up in May that are related to the classroom. And so we'd love to have specific questions maybe to think about in advance of that. So if you have any of those you'd like to drop them in the chat, please do. or send them over to any of us. You could send them over to Diana, to Jason, to myself, and I can forward them on as well. And thank you, Diana, for putting up the series that's coming up here. So we have 2 more coming up in May, providing accommodations through universal design and creating inclusive settings. So we hope you'll join for both of those. And as always, these sessions have been recorded, so you can see those on YouTube. And I want to thank again, Diana and Jason and everyone who came today for the wonderful insights. And we hope you join us for the next few. Thanks, everyone.
Coming.
Thank you.